My son and his wife tricked me into signing away my home just weeks after my husband died. They thought I was just a confused, grieving widow they could control and get rid of. They isolated me, took my car keys, and made me a prisoner in the very house we built, all so they could sell it from under me and leave me with nothing. But they made one fatal mistake. They had no idea my late husband left me a secret weapon. And the public reckoning I delivered wasn't just satisfying, but it was absolute. It's funny how a home can feel so full of ghosts even on a beautiful Sunday morning. The light was streaming through the bay window, catching dust motes dancing in the air just the way Robert always loved. We'd had 50 years of brunches in this dining room, and my first one without him felt like a hollow echo. My son Lance and his wife Ember were here with the kids, and you'd think that would help, but it didn't. There was a low hum of tension in the room that had nothing to do with grief. Ember's cheerfulness was so bright, it was sharp, like a shard of glass. She kept talking about how well I was holding up, how proud Robert would be. But her eyes weren't looking at me. They were scanning the room, taking inventory. She picked up a silver picture frame from the sideboard, one of Robert and me, on our wedding day. Her compliment on how lovely it was felt. Wrote, but the question that followed was not. She wanted to know what it was worth. Not in a sentimental way, but in a cold, hard financial way. It was like watching an appraiser at work. Across the table, Lance just stared down at his phone, his face gray with a weariness that went bone deep. He was there, but he wasn't. That brunch was the beginning. Over the next week, Ember launched a campaign of what she called concerned care. It started with her insisting on handling my mail, saying she wanted to sort out the junk to save me the trouble. Then she started answering the phone, telling my friends from the garden club that I was resting and shouldn't be disturbed. My friend Carol called 3 times before she finally got through to me, and even then, Ember was hovering nearby, listening to every word. It was all framed as love, as an effort to lighten my load, but it felt like a net being drawn tighter and tighter around me methodically, cutting every thread that connected me to the outside world. The worst of it came on a Thursday afternoon. Ember arrived in a whirlwind of manufactured energy, clutching a thick manila folder. She said they were just routine estate papers from the lawyer things to simplify my life now that Robert was gone. She spread the documents across the dining room table, talking a mile a minute about consolidating utility bills and property taxes. My head was spinning. She pointed to a signature line at the bottom of a page full of dense legal text. Her explanation was that it just put everything in Lance's name to make it easier for me, so I wouldn't have to worry about a thing. I was distracted, still foggy with grief, and honestly, I trusted her. She was my son's wife. So I picked up the pen and signed my name on the line she'd indicated with her perfectly manicured finger. The relief that washed over her face was so intense, it was almost unnerving. At the time, I told myself she was just happy to have helped. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house felt too quiet, too empty. I got up for a glass of water and walked past the guest room where they were staying. The door was cracked open just enough for a sliver of light to spill into the dark hallway. And then I heard her voice. It wasn't the bright, controlled tone she used with me. This was a frantic, terrified whisper laced with a panic so raw it made the hairs on my arms stand up. The words were clipped, desperate. She was saying the transfer hadn't cleared yet, that she didn't care what someone had said, they needed another 2 weeks. Then came the words that froze my blood. She said, if that payment bounces, we lose everything. In that one stolen moment, the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about simplifying my life. This wasn't about love or concern. This was about survival. And in their desperate struggle to stay afloat, they had just thrown me overboard. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I just lay there, staring into the darkness, the echo of Ember's terrified whisper playing over and over in my mind. The grief for Robert was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but something new had settled alongside it, a cold, hard clarity. The fog of sorrow had lifted, and I could see my son and his wife for exactly what they were. By the time the sun rose, the shock had burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated steel. They thought I was a confused old woman, a relic to be managed. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The next morning at breakfast, I was the picture of grandmotherly calm. I poured the coffee, buttered the toast, and smiled serenely, a mask I had perfected over decades of navigating family tensions. I waited for the right moment, a lull in the forced conversation. Then I turned to my son Lance, and in my most gentle, slightly befuddled voice, I made my first move. I told him I was thinking of updating the homeowner's insurance and that my memory was so foggy these days. I asked if he could remind me of the name of the family trust we'd put the house into years ago. Of course, Robert and I never put this house in a trust. It was in our names, plain and simple. I was laying a trap, and I just had to wait and see if they were clumsy enough to walk into it. The question hit Lance like a punch to the gut. He literally choked on his coffee, his eyes wide with panic. Across the table, Ember shot him a look so venomous it could have curdled milk. He stammered, grabbing for a name out of thin air, telling me it was the Miller Family Trust. Before the words were even fully out of his mouth, Ember jumped in her voice, a little too smooth, a little too bright. She told him, "No, darling, he was mistaken. It was the Greenwich Legacy Trust." Their eyes met for a split second, and in that glance I saw it all: shared panic, a frantic attempt to cover a lie, and the dawning horror that they had failed. They were amateurs. The realization didn't bring me comfort, but it confirmed my deepest fears and solidified my resolve. They weren't just cruel, they were sloppy. Their flimsy story had collapsed, and they knew it. Ember grabbed Lance by the arm and practically dragged him out into the garden for what I could only assume was a very tense and whispered argument. That was the opportunity I needed. I moved quickly, heading straight for Robert's study. This room, my sanctuary of grief, now felt like a command center. Robert had been a meticulous planner, always 3 steps ahead of everyone. In the back of his desk drawer, beneath a false bottom, was an old prepaid burner phone he'd tucked away years ago for what he called a true emergency. I think this qualified. I dialed a number I knew by heart. A crisp voice answered on the first ring. It was Arthur Vance Roberts, estate lawyer, for 40 years a man as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I spoke only 7 words, my voice low and steady. I told him, "Arthur, it's Mabel. They've made a move." When they came back inside, the atmosphere in the house had changed. It was no longer just tense. It was suffocating. Ember's caring facade had completely disintegrated, replaced by a cold, barely concealed hostility. She told me I was clearly confused, that I'd had a bit of a scare and needed to stay home and rest. Then she did something that escalated everything. She walked over to the hook by the door and took my car keys. For my own safety, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. That's when I truly understood. I was no longer just a victim of their greed. I was a prisoner in my own home, and this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about control. And the situation had just become far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. A cornered animal is the most dangerous, and I knew that taking Ember's keys had cornered her. A direct fight was a fight I would lose, at least for now. So I made a strategic decision. I retreated. The next morning, I was no longer the woman who had laid a clever trap at breakfast. I was frail, Forgetful Mabel again. I apologized to Ember for being so confused the day before, thanking her for being so patient with me. I let my hands tremble a little when I held my coffee cup. It was a performance, and to my surprise, they bought it completely. The tension in the house eased. They saw my brief spark of defiance as a final flickering ember of the woman I used to be, now extinguished. They relaxed, convinced their clumsy panic was a one-time scare. They believed they had regained control, and with that belief, their arrogance began to grow like a weed. I didn't know the full desperate story then, of course, but I found out later what was really happening behind their panicked eyes. They had been at one of those lavish investment seminars in a hotel ballroom, the kind with catered lunches and promises that shine a little too brightly. A charismatic man selling a fund called Apex Private Equity had wooed them with charts showing impossible guaranteed returns. They were told it was exclusive, a chance to get in on the ground floor. So they liquidated everything their savings. The kids' college funds even took a second mortgage on their own house. And then the fund and the charismatic man simply vanished. At that very moment, while I was playing the part of a doddering old woman, Ember was staring at a foreclosure notice on her phone, a frantic text from another scammed investor burning on the screen. It said the extension expired on Friday. After that, everyone would be notified. Their entire world, built on the illusion of Greenwich success, was about to be exposed as a house of cards. My feigned weakness gave me the one thing I needed most: privacy. Every afternoon, I would say I was going upstairs for a nap. They were happy to leave me alone, believing I was fading. But I wasn't napping. I was in Robert's study, my new command center. Robert had left me a small, ornate key, telling me it was for a rainy day. I used it to open a hidden compartment he'd built into the back of his heavy oak desk. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger. On the cover, in his familiar, elegant script, were 2 words, "The Widow's Ledger." My hands shook as I opened it. It was all there. A secret financial life Robert had built to protect us. Account numbers for funds in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Deeds to commercial properties held in anonymous LLCs. And detailed step-by-step instructions. While my jailers downstairs were planning how to sell my house, I was sitting on a hidden empire. Using the burner phone and an old laptop I'd kept hidden in a hat box, I began my counteroffensive, making quiet, untraceable transfers, moving the pieces on a chessboard they didn't even know existed. Their overconfidence made them sloppy. Late one afternoon, as I was pretending to sleep, I heard Ember's voice echoing up from the downstairs hallway. She was speaking loudly, arrogantly, into her phone. It was a real estate agent. She was discussing a quick, all-cash sale for my house. I crept to the top of the stairs, listening. I heard her tell the agent not to worry about the title search, that it was clean. Her voice dripped with smug triumph when she said the old woman had signed it over herself and that they could close in 10 days. She had no idea that I had picked up the old extension phone in the upstairs hall, the receiver pressed so tightly to my ear I could hear her every breath. I wrote it all down. The agent's name, the 10-day timeline, every single damning word. She had just handed me the final piece of my own plan. I spent the next few days in my command center, a ghost in my own home. My days were a quiet rhythm of feigned naps and secret activity. With every untraceable transfer I made from the widow's ledger, I felt a piece of myself, a part that had been dormant for years, waking up. Robert had left me a fortress, and I was finally learning how to command its armies. I chose my moment carefully. Friday, the day Ember's extension expired. The day her world was set to come crashing down. I wanted the pressure to be at its absolute maximum when the first shot was fired. Friday morning was thick with a strange, frantic energy. Ember was glued to her phone, pacing the living room like a caged tiger. Lance just sat at the dining table staring into a cold cup of coffee, the picture of a defeated man. They were waiting for the axe to fall. They just had no idea which direction it was coming from. And then, at precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, authoritative sound that cut through the tension. Ember, probably thinking it was her real estate agent, flung the door open. But it wasn't the agent. Standing on the porch, looking like an executioner in a perfectly tailored suit, was Arthur Vance. And beside him, in a crisp uniform that seemed to suck all the air out of the morning, was a sheriff's deputy. Arthur didn't wait for an invitation. He and the deputy stepped right past a stunned Ember and into the living room. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who owned any room he entered. His eyes, cold and sharp, landed on Ember. He didn't raise his voice, but every word was a hammer blow. He was there, he announced, to serve her with a cease and desist, as well as a notice of impending legal action for felony elder fraud and fraudulent conveyance. The legal jargon, so cold and official, was the trigger. Arthur placed a folder on the coffee table. Inside was a copy of the quitclaim deed she had tricked me into signing, and beside it, a report from a handwriting expert confirming it had been signed under duress. That's when the dam of Ember's composure didn't just crack. It exploded. She collapsed onto the sofa with a raw, ugly sob of pure terror. The polished, in-control woman was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified creature. She started wailing at Lance, the words tumbling out between gasps. She screamed that he didn't understand that they had been scammed and had lost everything. The house, the college funds, all of it was gone. The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Lance looked like he'd been struck. He was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. It was clear this was the first he was hearing about the full extent of their ruin. Their pathetic conspiracy evaporated in that moment, replaced by the bitter sting of betrayal. He yelled at her, his voice cracking, asking why she hadn't told him. He thought it was just a market downturn, something she had under control. All the while, the sheriff's deputy stood by the door watching impassively. His silent presence transformed this from a messy family argument into a public spectacle, the very thing Ember had sacrificed her soul to avoid. That was my cue. I walked slowly down the grand staircase, my hand gliding along the polished banister. I was no longer frail, no longer confused. I was calm, composed, and in absolute command. My quiet footsteps on the old wood were the only sound in the room. I stopped at the bottom and looked at the wreckage of my family. I said it was enough. The room fell silent. My eyes met Ember's. Her face was a ruin of tears and mascara, her body shuddering with sobs. I told her my voice, even and low, that she would be at Arthur's office the next morning at 9 o'clock. She would bring her husband, and she would listen. In that moment, the power in the house shifted completely and permanently. I was no longer the victim. I was the one dictating terms, leaving them powerless, stripped of their lies, and terrified of the public ruin that was now not just a possibility, but a certainty. The walk into Arthur Vance's law firm the next morning was the quietest I had ever shared with my son. Lance was a ghost, his face pale and drawn. Ember was even worse. She looked like a hollowed-out shell of the vibrant, aggressive woman she had been. She was wearing expensive clothes that now seemed to hang off her, a costume for a part she could no longer play. They thought this was just a meeting. They had no idea it was a reckoning. Arthur led us into a large conference room, all dark wood and leather, with a window that looked out over the Long Island Sound. And sitting at the far end of the polished table, his expression carefully neutral, was a man they both recognized instantly, Mr. Davies, the manager of the bank that held the mortgage on their own over-leveraged house. The flicker of raw panic in Ember's eyes told me she finally understood. This was not a negotiation, it was a judgment. We sat in a heavy, suffocating silence. I didn't say a word. I let Arthur be my voice, my sword. He began calmly, systematically, his voice never rising but cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel. He laid out the case with cold, undeniable precision. First, he placed the fraudulent quitclaim deed in the center of the table. Then came the phone records, a detailed log of Ember's frantic calls to the real estate agent proving her intent to sell my home out from under me. And then, with a quiet thud that seemed to shake the room, he placed a thick, leather-bound binder on the table. He let his hand rest on it for a moment. He announced that this was what we were calling the widow's ledger. He explained that it detailed the assets of the late Mr. Miller, assets of which they were clearly and fatally unaware. The judgment, when it came, wasn't from me. It was from the quiet man at the end of the table. As Arthur began to read from the ledger detailing a web of anonymous LLCs holding commercial properties, outlining offshore accounts, holding tens of millions of dollars, I watched Mr. Davies. His professional mask never slipped, but his eyes grew colder, harder. He looked down at the folder in front of him, which I knew contained the foreclosure notice for Ember and Lance's property. He was a man who dealt in risk, and he now realized he was sitting across from two people who were not just bad risks, but active fraudsters. When Arthur finished, Mr. Davies folded his hands on the table. He addressed them both formally, his voice devoid of any warmth. He said that given this new information regarding their financial situation, the bank would be calling in their loan immediately. It was a social and financial death sentence delivered in the quiet, sterile language of banking. Then finally, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. I laid out my terms. They were not cruel, but they were absolute. First, I told them they would sign a document right then and there. It would nullify the deed transfer and include a full signed confession of their actions. In exchange, I would waive my right to press criminal charges. I wasn't interested in putting them in jail. Second, I informed them that they would have no further access to this family's finances ever. The Bank of Mabel was officially closed. And third, my final condition. They would go home and tell their children the truth. Not a sanitized version, but the whole ugly story. No more lies. My justice was not a prison cell, but a life sentence of inescapable truth. The one thing their carefully constructed world of appearances could never survive. I left Arthur's office that day and never looked back. The signing of the confession was a quiet, pathetic affair. Ember's hand shook so badly, she could barely hold the pen. Lance just stared at the polished wood of the table, his signature a weak, defeated scrawl. I didn't feel triumph, only a deep, weary sadness for the family I had lost, and a quiet resolve for the one I now had to protect. The aftermath, as you might expect in a place like Greenwich, was swift and brutal. Bad news travels faster than good, and the rumor mill went into overdrive. The story of the Apex private equity scam, coupled with the sudden and very public calling in of their loan, was a cocktail of failure and scandal that our community could not resist. They were forced to sell their house in a hurry, taking a significant loss. Friends who had once flocked to their dinner parties suddenly stopped calling. Invitations to the charity galas and country club events, the very oxygen of Ember's social life, simply ceased to arrive. They were left with nothing but the quiet, echoing consequences of their own choices. It was in the silence that their two paths diverged. Lance, humbled and broken by the public exposure of his wife's lies, seemed to find a piece of himself he'd lost long ago. He took a modest job in the city, one that didn't come with a fancy title, but did come with an honest paycheck. He started the slow, painful process of rebuilding his life from the ground up. I heard from the grandchildren that he was the one who finally sat them down and told them the whole unvarnished truth. He was trying to earn back their trust, a currency far more valuable than any he had lost. Ember, however, remained trapped in a prison of her own denial. She blamed the charismatic man who had scammed them. She blamed Lance for being weak. She blamed me for not simply handing over what she felt she was owed. She blamed everyone but the person in the mirror. Her bitterness was a poison she drank every day, expecting everyone else to fall. While their world shrank, mine began to open up again. I sold the big Greenwich house, the one filled with 50 years of memories. It was time to let the ghosts rest. On my own terms, I found a lovely, smaller home with a garden that was just waiting for me. With a significant portion of the money from the sale and from the untouched assets in the widow's ledger, I worked with Arthur to set up protected, ironclad educational trusts for my grandchildren. Their future would be secure, safe from the mistakes of their parents. I reconnected with my friends from the garden club. I started volunteering at the local library, and I found a quiet purpose in philanthropy. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving, breathing air that was finally free of lies and tension. Months later, I was sitting in my new garden, a cup of tea warming my hands as I watched the autumn leaves fall. The postman had left a single letter. It was a simple, handwritten note on plain stationery. It was from Lance. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it, not knowing what to expect. It wasn't a request for forgiveness. It wasn't a plea for money. It was just 2 short sentences. He wrote, "Thank you, Mom, for stopping us." I folded the letter and held it to my chest. A single tear, born of both sorrow and wisdom, rolled down my cheek. I finally had my peace. I had my freedom. And Robert's legacy, the one I had fought so hard to protect, was finally truly secure. My pain had been forged into a quiet, unshakable strength, and in my garden, surrounded by the life I had chosen, I was finally home. In the end, Mabel's story wasn't just about getting even. It was a lesson in the quiet, devastating power of truth. She came to understand that her family's cruelty wasn't born from pure evil, but from a deep, corrosive desperation. Yet understanding their fear never meant excusing their actions. Her true victory wasn't in their financial ruin, but in stripping away their lies and forcing them to live in the reality of what they had done. She taught them that the most profound justice isn't about punishment, but about the calm, unbreakable weight of consequences.